They tell you land doesn't remember. That it's just dirt and rock and water doing what gravity tells it to do. But if that were true, then explain why the orchard still bloomed after my wife died. Explain why the creek still sang at dawn, even when the house went quiet. Explain why the morning they tried to carve a road through my mountain, the wind came down the slope like a warning breath. Some places don't forget. And some people make the mistake of thinking silence means surrender. My name is Elias Rourke, and for 32 years I have lived on the eastern face of Granite Hollow, where the mountains fold inward like clasped hands and the snowmelt feeds a creek that never runs dry. The orchard sits on a series of stone terraces my grandfather built after the war, hauling rock by hand, one stubborn apple tree at a time. From above, it looks like the mountain learned how to breathe. From below, it looks like something too old to argue with. I inherited this land the way most real inheritances happen, not with lawyers and champagne, but with dirt under the fingernails and a promise made quietly over a hospital bed. My wife Mara was lying there when she made me swear I wouldn't sell, not because it was valuable, but because it was alive. The orchard fed the watershed. The watershed fed 3 towns downstream. You don't break a chain like that without consequences. Cancer doesn't care about chains, it takes what it wants and leaves you holding whatever's left. After Mara passed, the house changed. Sound traveled differently. Even the clock seemed louder. Some mornings I'd pour 2 cups of coffee before remembering I only needed 1. Grief has a way of hiding in habits. The orchard saved me. Grief needs work to burn against, and apple trees are honest work. They don't care how you feel. They need pruning when they need pruning. They need water when the snowpack is thin. They need you to show up. By the time the first survey stakes appeared, I had been alone on that mountain for 19 months. Long enough to know every sound it made. Long enough to know when something didn't belong. The stakes showed up in spring, bright orange and arrogant, hammered into soil that hadn't been measured by anyone with permission since 1954. I noticed them the way you notice a wrong note in a familiar song, not all at once, just enough to know something was off. 2 days later, the letters arrived. They came in thick envelopes with glossy logos and friendly fonts. Words like community enhancement, access improvement, shared use corridor. Language designed to soften the blade. According to the paperwork, a scenic mobility trail was scheduled to pass directly through the upper terraces of my orchard, following the creek line I had protected my entire adult life. There was no knock, no call, no conversation, just assumptions printed in color. I drove into town and asked at the county office. The clerk looked uncomfortable, which is never a good sign. She slid a document across the counter and said someone had filed an updated easement amendment. Recreational use, public access, approved. Approved by who, I asked. She didn't answer that question. That was the day I heard the name Helena Crown for the first time. Helena Crown had moved into Granite Hollow Estates the previous year, a development carved into the western ridge with glass houses and imported trees that didn't belong at altitude. She was 50, impeccably maintained, and had made her fortune in private equity before discovering local governance as a hobby. She was now the chair of the Granite Hollow Preservation Council, which would have been funny if it hadn't been dangerous. Preservation, as she used it, meant preservation of views, not systems. Aesthetic, not function. Our first meeting happened at my gate. She didn't step out of her SUV at first, just rolled the window down halfway, sunglasses on, smile calibrated. "Mr. Rourke," she said, like we were already acquainted, "I'm so glad we can finally speak face to face." I told her she was standing on private land. She laughed lightly and said, "Not for long." Helena had a voice trained for rooms with power. Smooth, unhurried, certain. She spoke the way people do when they've never been told no by anything that mattered. She explained that the trail would bring value to the area, that the orchard was underutilized, that I could apply for compensation once the project was complete. I asked her where she got permission. She handed me a copy of a document with my name on it, my signature at the bottom, misspelled. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't have to. I told her the document was fraudulent and that she and her counsel were trespassing. She tilted her head, studied me, then smiled again. "Elias," she said gently, "people like you always think the mountain will protect them." That night I sat on the porch and listened to the creek. I thought about Mara, about promises, about how some people mistake kindness for weakness because they've never needed either to survive. The next week, the pressure started. Notices about safety inspections, complaints about runoff, Anonymous calls suggesting my orchard posed a landslide risk. A reporter emailed asking for comment about allegations I was obstructing public access to natural resources. Helena never contacted me directly again. She didn't need to. She moved through committees and consultants, through language and process. She understood systems the way gamblers understand odds, not to respect them but to bend them. What she didn't understand was land that kills shortcuts. The upper terraces sit on shale and root structure that requires careful balance. Remove the trees, compact the soil, reroute water, and the mountain doesn't argue. It moves, slowly at first, then all at once. I filed formal objections. I hired a local attorney who specialized in watershed law. We found inconsistencies immediately. The easement amendment had been filed without environmental review. The signature wasn't mine. The council had exceeded its jurisdiction. Helena responded by accelerating construction timelines. Bulldozers arrived at dawn one morning, idling below the orchard like animals waiting to be loosed. Diesel smoke drifted upward through apple blossoms. The sound traveled wrong through the valley, heavy and invasive. I walked down the path and stood in front of them. The operator looked relieved when he saw me, like he'd been hoping someone would stop this before it got complicated. Helena arrived 10 minutes later, phone already recording. "This is necessary," she said, loud enough for the camera. "Progress always hurts a little at first." I told her to leave. She smiled and said, "You're standing in the way of the future." What she didn't know was that the mountain had already chosen its side. And so had I. The mountain doesn't react immediately when you insult it. It waits. People mistake that patience for permission. After the bulldozers showed up, Helena Crown stopped pretending this was about a trail. The language shifted, so did the tone. The letters grew sharper, the deadlines shorter, the consequences louder. Everything was framed as concern, of course. Concern for safety, concern for access, concern for the greater good, that phrase people use when they want something badly enough to hurt others for it. My attorney, Daniel Holt, had spent 27 years dealing with land disputes, most of them ugly in their own way. When he reviewed Helena's filings, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled through his nose. Not a sigh, something closer to irritation mixed with curiosity. "She's not sloppy," he said. "She's aggressive, that's worse." We found forged minutes from council meetings that never happened. Environmental reports copied from unrelated sites and rebranded. Claims that the orchard was abandoned, unmanaged, unsafe. None of it was true, but truth isn't the first casualty in conflicts like this. It's the first tool they try to bury. Helena filed an injunction accusing me of obstructing a public works project. She requested emergency access rights to my land, citing hypothetical rescue scenarios that conveniently placed the trail exactly where the orchard terraces were most fragile. Daniel countered with photographs, records, decades of water flow data. We requested independent review. Helena responded by launching a public campaign. That's when the flyers appeared. Glossy, expensive, professionally designed. Photos of smiling families biking through pristine mountain scenery. At the bottom, in smaller print, a warning about privately owned landowners restricting community access to shared natural resources. No names, but everyone knew who it meant. Someone spray-painted greedy on my gate one night. Another morning, I found trash dumped near the creek, photographed and reported anonymously as environmental neglect. I cleaned it all up, every time, quietly documented everything. Grief teaches you endurance. Loss strips away the need to be liked. I wasn't fighting for popularity, I was fighting for continuity. Helena escalated again. A private security firm started parking near the lower road, taking photos of vehicles that visited my property. They claimed it was for community safety. Daniel discovered the firm wasn't licensed in the state. When we filed a complaint, Helena replaced them with another company, this one better dressed and more careful. One afternoon, I returned from town to find the orchard's irrigation valves tampered with. Not broken, just adjusted enough to disrupt flow to the upper terraces. It was subtle, the kind of sabotage meant to be deniable. That night, as I reset the system, I felt something shift inside me, not anger, clarity. Helena wasn't trying to win legally, she was trying to exhaust me, to turn my life into paperwork and defense and constant vigilance until selling felt like relief. I understood that strategy. I'd seen it before in quieter forms. The difference was that Helena believed pressure always worked. She believed systems bent eventually. She believed people broke. She didn't understand mountains. The creek runs cold even in summer, fed by snowfields that don't care about development schedules. Its banks are reinforced by roots older than zoning laws. Any disturbance echoes downstream. I contacted the Regional Watershed Authority directly, not to complain, to inform. I requested historical flow comparisons, soil stability assessments, independent review by people who answered to geology, not donors. Helena responded by accusing me of harassment. The irony was almost impressive. She filed a restraining request claiming my refusal to cooperate constituted intimidation. She cited my presence at construction sites as aggressive. The court denied it, but the filing itself served its purpose. It painted a narrative. Meanwhile, the pressure seeped closer to home. One night, the power went out, not across the valley, just my property. The breaker box had been opened and shut improperly, damaging components, expensive components. Daniel advised me to file a police report. I did. Nothing came of it. Helena hosted a community meeting at the estate's clubhouse. I didn't attend. I watched the recording later. She spoke about stewardship, about moving forward, about honoring the land by making it accessible. She never once mentioned the orchard fed the watershed. I started sleeping lighter, not from fear, from awareness, the kind that keeps you alert to unfamiliar sounds, tires on gravel where they shouldn't be, voices carried uphill. One morning, I found stakes placed higher up the slope beyond the proposed trail line. That was new, that was bold. Daniel confirmed what I already suspected. She's positioning for acquisition, he said, not just access control. The estates had backing, quiet money, developers who specialized in eco-luxury projects, words that meant destruction dressed as mindfulness. If Helena could force a compliance order or paint me as a liability, the mountain would be reclassified. And once that happened, nothing would stop them. I thought of Mara, of the way she used to walk the terraces in early autumn, brushing her fingers against apple skins, choosing which ones were ready. She believed stewardship wasn't ownership, it was responsibility. Helena believed responsibility could be outsourced. The sabotage grew bolder. Someone cut a section of deer fencing near the creek, then reported it as neglect. I repaired it the same day. A drone appeared overhead one afternoon, hovering low enough that I could hear its motors whining against the wind. It retreated when I raised my hand, as if startled by the idea of being noticed. Daniel advised restraint, let them make mistakes, document everything. That advice paid off sooner than expected. A local environmental scientist contacted me quietly. She'd been asked to sign off on an impact assessment she hadn't conducted. When she refused, Helena's counsel replaced her with a consultant from out of state, one whose firm had been fined previously for falsifying reports. That was the crack. We filed a formal complaint with the state, provided documentation, emails, metadata. Helena's response was swift and vicious. She accused me publicly of falsifying records, claimed I was manipulating regulators to block progress. The word hoarder appeared in a local opinion piece. Hoarder. As if land was something to clutch instead of care for. That was the night someone tried to light a fire near the lower orchard. Not a full blaze, just enough to scorch grass and leave a message. I stood there afterwards, smoke still hanging low, and felt the mountain settle around me, heavy, solid, waiting. Daniel's voice was tight when I called him. She's crossed a line, he said, and she doesn't realize it yet. What Helena didn't know was that escalation attracts attention, and attention, once focused, is hard to redirect. The state opened a review, quiet at first, then broader. Financial records were requested, permits examined, communications subpoenaed. Helena went silent, no more flyers, no more smiles. The calm before exposure. I walked the terraces that evening, touching stone laid by hands long gone. The orchard was steady, the creek unchanged. Whatever Helena thought she was fighting, it wasn't me. It was time. Exposure doesn't arrive with sirens. It arrives with paperwork. Quiet requests, follow-up questions, the kind that make confident people suddenly careful about their words. Helena Crown sensed it before she saw it. People like her always do. The emails slowed. The council meetings were postponed. Consultants stopped returning calls. Silence settled around her the way fog settles into low ground, heavy and inescapable. The state review expanded into an audit, then another. The Watershed Authority requested financial disclosures tied to the trail project. That was when the story began slipping out of her control. I wasn't invited to the meetings where it happened, but Daniel kept me informed. He said the room changed when the money trail surfaced. That's always the turning point. Ideology is flexible, accounting is. The Preservation Council funds had been routed through shell vendors. Environmental studies billed but never conducted. Emergency consulting fees paid to companies that existed only on paper. And beneath it all, purchase options. Land acquisition contingencies. Development forecasts tied to rezoning approvals that assumed my orchard would be gone. This was never about access. It was about erasure. The regional paper broke the story first. Small headline, buried on page 3, but it named names, it printed figures, it asked questions Helena hadn't prepared answers for. Her response was immediate. A press release blaming clerical errors, consultants' miscommunication. She promised transparency. She promised cooperation. She promised everything except accountability. The community meeting was scheduled for the following Monday, mandatory attendance according to the notice. The council framed it as clarification, reassurance. Daniel smiled when he read it. They don't call meetings when they're winning, he said. The night before the meeting, I walked the orchard alone. The moon was high, the kind of brightness that flattens shadows and sharpens edges. I stood near the upper terraces where the creek narrowed and listened to the water moving over stone. There's a sound water makes right before it changes course. A subtle shift, you don't hear it unless you're listening for it. The meeting hall sat at the base of the western ridge, glass and steel pretending humility. Cars filled the lot early. News vans lined the road. The community came out in force, curiosity outweighing loyalty. Helena arrived last, black coat, perfect posture. She walked like nothing had changed. The meeting began with rehearsed calm, talking points, slides about vision and progress. Helena spoke about misunderstandings, about moving forward together. Then the questions started. A retired hydrologist stood and asked why his data had been altered. A local contractor asked why his company had been listed as a vendor without his consent. A woman from the estates asked why emergency funds had paid for private travel. Helena deflected, redirected, smiled. Until the state representative stood up. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. He introduced himself, stated his authority, and outlined the scope of the investigation. He listed discrepancies. He cited statutes. He requested cooperation. The room went still. Helena's smile finally faltered, just slightly. She argued jurisdiction, claimed political motivation. She gestured toward me, seated near the back, and suggested this was all the result of one man's refusal to compromise. That's when Daniel stood. He didn't speak long, he didn't dramatize, he presented evidence, side-by-side documents, forged signatures, altered reports, financial transfers. Facts don't need performance. Helena interrupted him, her composure cracked. She accused me of manipulation, of leveraging grief, of weaponizing the land against progress. The word weaponizing hung in the air. I stood then, not because I needed to defend myself, but because silence had done enough. I told them about the orchard, about the creek, about how water doesn't belong to anyone but responsibility does. I told them the land fed them whether they acknowledged it or not. I told them shortcuts on mountains come due eventually. I didn't mention Mara, I didn't have to. Helena left the hall before the meeting adjourned, walked fast, head high, the kind of exit meant to look intentional. Outside, the air had shifted. Wind moved down the slope, cold and sudden, the kind that carries weather. What happened next was later described as an accident, and in the strictest sense that was true. Helena reached her vehicle at the edge of the lot, parked closer to the slope than recommended. She opened the door, fumbling with her phone, agitation finally breaking through control. Above us, the mountain did what mountains do when pressure has been applied improperly for too long. A sound rolled down the slope, low, deep, not loud at first, just heavy. Stone doesn't rush, it commits. The retaining wall above the access cut gave way, not catastrophically, precisely. Soil shifted, rock followed. The movement redirected itself along the disturbed channel where survey stakes had been driven. No one was hurt, that mattered. That was the difference between tragedy and lesson. But Helena's vehicle was caught in the path, not crushed, buried, pinned beneath earth that no longer recognized ownership. People ran, shouted, phones came out. I didn't move. The mountain settled again, as if satisfied. Emergency crews arrived, protocols activated, assessments began, the slope was declared unstable, access was restricted, construction halted indefinitely. The investigation accelerated overnight. Environmental negligence was added to the list. Endangerment, fraud. Helena Crown did not return to Granite Hollow Estates. Her resignation came 3 days later, brief, unapologetic. She cited health reasons, she cited harassment, she cited everything except the truth. The truth didn't need her consent anymore. Assets were frozen, accounts examined, subpoenas issued. The council dissolved under pressure, new leadership stepped in quietly, cautiously. The orchard remained untouched. The state declared the upper ridge protected watershed land, permanent, non-negotiable. Reporters asked me how it felt. I told them mountains don't feel, they respond. Some stories don't end with cheers, they end with quiet correction. I returned to the terraces the next morning. The creek had changed course slightly, avoiding the disturbed channel entirely. Water finds stability, always has. I stood there and listened. The mountain remembered. After the mountain moved, everything else felt smaller. Not insignificant, just properly scaled. Investigations don't end the way movies pretend they do. There's no single moment where justice arrives fully formed and announced. It comes in increments, filings, rulings, quiet phone calls that change futures without ceremony. Helena Crown's name faded from the valley faster than I expected. Not erased, just archived, a cautionary entry in meeting minutes and legal briefs. Her assets were tied up in litigation, her reputation became radioactive, the kind that follows you into rooms you haven't entered yet. Granite Hollow Estates rebranded within months. New signage, new leadership, words like coexistence and stewardship replaced access and enhancement. It was cosmetic at first, but language shapes behavior when people are paying attention. The state finalized the watershed designation in early autumn, permanent protection. No development corridors, no exceptions buried in fine print. The creek was formally recognized as critical flow infrastructure for 3 downstream municipalities. I stood with Daniel at the signing, pen hovering for a moment longer than necessary, not hesitation, recognition. This wasn't a victory over someone, it was a commitment to something. The orchard entered its quietest season after that. No surveyors, no drones, no unfamiliar vehicles on the lower road. The mountain exhaled. Grief doesn't disappear when conflict ends. If anything, silence makes it louder at first. Without the pressure, memories have room to stretch. I found myself talking to Mara again, out loud, telling her about the apples that year, how the yield surprised me despite everything, about how the creek held steady through a dry summer because the terraces remained intact. I imagined her nodding the way she used to, eyes already scanning the trees, always thinking 3 seasons ahead. The community shifted in subtle ways. School groups visited the orchard as part of watershed education programs, not tour, lessons. Kids learned how water moves through land, how trees hold soil, how choices upstream echo below. I didn't dramatize the story for them, I didn't need to, the land did that on its own. A bench was installed near the upper terraces, simple wood and stone, no plaque at first, just a place to sit and listen. Eventually, someone added a small marker for those who kept watch. I didn't remove it. Daniel and I stayed in touch after the case closed, not professionally, personally. He told me my situation had become a reference point in land law circles, not the confrontation, the restraint, The documentation, the refusal to escalate until escalation became unavoidable. That's what held, he said once, you let the truth do the heavy lifting. Winter came early that year. Snow settled into the terraces, insulating roots, slowing everything down. I spent evenings reading by the fire, the house less quiet than it had been before, not full, just balanced. Sometimes people ask if I feel vindicated. Vindication implies something owed. I don't feel owed anything. I feel aligned with the land, with the promise I made, with the understanding that not every battle needs a hero, some need a witness. The orchard continues. Apples don't care about headlines, they respond to pruning, to water, to time. In spring, blossoms return like they always do, unbothered by memory, faithful to cycle. The creek sang at dawn. Granite Hollow learned something it didn't expect to, that preservation isn't about access, it's about restraint, about knowing when not to touch something just because you can. Helena Crown tried to modernize a mountain. She treated it like a surface problem, something that could be optimized. Mountains don't optimize, they endure. I still walk the terraces every morning, I still check the valves, I still listen for wrong notes in familiar songs. Somewhere downstream, people drink water that never learned my name. That's how it should be. If there's a lesson in this, it isn't about standing your ground loudly. It's about understanding what ground you're standing on. Land remembers when people forget. And it responds when pushed too far. That's not revenge. That's balance. If you stayed with this story, you already understand why it mattered. And if you didn't, the mountain doesn't need you to.